There are 255 pyramids in Sudan. Egypt has 138. And you have almost certainly never been taught the name of the civilization that built them. That is not an accident. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush, the most powerful African empire you were never taught about. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand not just who they were, but exactly why the world forgot them. Stay with me, because what was done to this civilization's legacy is one of the greatest acts of historical erasure ever committed. Before we go any further, I need you to picture something. It is 747 BC. Egypt, the civilization we are all taught is the pinnacle of ancient African achievement, is in chaos. The empire is fragmented, weak, divided by competing rulers who cannot agree on anything. The Great Pyramids at Giza are already over 1,500 years old. The glory days of the pharaohs feel like a distant memory. And then something happens that the history books almost never mention. An army marches north out of sub-Saharan Africa. They cross deserts that would kill most armies. They are disciplined, organized, and led by a king who believes he is on a divine mission. And when they reach Egypt, they do not just raid it, they conquer it. The entire Nile Valley, from deep in what is now Sudan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, falls under the control of a black African king named Paye. For nearly 100 years, an African dynasty from deep in the continent rules Egypt. They are known to historians as the 25th dynasty. To everyone else, they are almost completely unknown. And the kingdom they came from, and the kingdom that produced them, is the story we are telling today. Now here's the first thing I need to correct before we go any further. Most people who have heard of Nubia think of it as a minor civilization on the edge of Egypt. A secondary culture, a neighbor, at best a footnote. That could not be further from the truth. The Kingdom of Kush, which controlled much of what is now Sudan and stretches of Ethiopia and Egypt, existed for over 3,000 years. 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, the United States of America is 250 years old. The entire recorded history of Western Europe as we know it covers about 2,000 years. The Kingdom of Kush outlasted both. It was not a minor civilization on the edge of Egypt. In many periods of history, it was more powerful, more stable, and more wealthy than Egypt itself. So why have you never heard of it? We will get to that. But first, let us understand what they actually built. The pyramids of the Kingdom of Kush are located primarily in 3 sites in modern-day Sudan: Meroe, Nuri, El Kuru, and they are extraordinary. But they look different from the Egyptian pyramids most people know. The Kushite pyramids are steeper, narrower. They rise at a sharper angle, almost like a needle pointing toward the sky. And they are smaller than the Great Pyramid at Giza. When European explorers first encountered them in the 19th century, many dismissed them as inferior copies of Egyptian architecture. As imitations, the smaller size was taken as evidence of a lesser civilization. This interpretation was wrong, and it was not accidental. Here is what the explorers chose to ignore. The Kushite pyramids were not inferior versions of Egyptian pyramids. They were a distinct architectural tradition that evolved over centuries. The steeper angle was deliberate, reflecting different theological beliefs about the path between earth and the divine. The concentrated energy of a narrower form was intentional, and there are more of them. 255 pyramids across the Kushite heartland, built over a period of roughly 800 years. Each one a burial monument for a king or queen. Each one representing a society sophisticated enough to sustain this level of monumental construction for 8 consecutive centuries. The civilization that built the most pyramids in human history. And almost nobody knows their name. Drop a comment below right now, before we go any further. Had you ever heard of the Kingdom of Kush before this video? I genuinely want to know, because the answer tells us something important about whose history gets taught and whose gets buried. But here's where the story gets darker. In 1834, an Italian explorer named Giuseppe Ferlini arrived at the pyramid fields of Meroe. What happened next is one of the most destructive acts of archaeological vandalism in human history. Ferlini, searching for treasure, ordered the tops of 40 Kushite pyramids to be demolished. smashed open, torn apart stone by a workforce of local laborers he had hired. 40 pyramids, gone. Their pointed tops blasted away. Their burial chambers torn open. Ferlini did find treasure in one of them. Gold jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. Pieces so sophisticated that when he brought them back to Europe and tried to sell them, experts refused to believe they were African in origin. They insisted the jewelry must have come from somewhere else. Must have been made by someone else. Because the prevailing belief in 19th century Europe was that sub-Saharan Africa was not capable of producing art of this quality. The jewelry sits today in museums in Munich and Berlin. The pyramids Ferlini destroyed cannot be rebuilt. That is what erasure looks like. Not just forgetting. Active destruction, followed by denial. Let us go back further, because to understand what was lost, we need to understand what was there. The Kingdom of Kush emerges clearly in the historical record around 2500 BC, roughly the same period as the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The earliest capital is at a city called Kerma, on the banks of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan. Kerma is one of the earliest cities in sub-Saharan Africa. It has monumental architecture, a sophisticated trading economy, evidence of complex social hierarchy and religious organization. For centuries, Kerma and Egypt exist in a complicated relationship. Sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, always aware of each other. And then around 1500 BC, Egypt conquers Kush and rules it as a colony for nearly 500 years. Now here is what is remarkable about what happens next. During those 500 years of Egyptian colonial rule, the Kushites do not simply disappear into Egyptian culture, they absorb it. They learn its language, its religious practices, its architectural traditions, its administrative systems. They take everything Egypt has to offer, and then when Egyptian power weakens, they use everything they learned to build something larger. This is the moment Paye marches north. This is the moment a Kushite king becomes pharaoh of Egypt, and what follows is one of the most fascinating cultural phenomena in ancient history. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty become more Egyptian than the Egyptians. They restore temples that had fallen into disrepair. They revive religious traditions that had been abandoned. They bring stability to a fractured empire. Ancient historians describe them as guardians of Egyptian tradition. They build pyramids for their own burials in the Kushite homeland, because they wanted to honor the most sacred traditions of the civilization they had come to rule. The people who built more pyramids than Egypt were doing so, in part, as an act of cultural reverence toward Egypt. The irony is extraordinary. The student outbuilding the teacher, the colony returning to restore the empire. Now I want to tell you about a woman. Her name was Amanirenas. She was the queen of the Kushite kingdom of Meroe. She ruled around 40 BC, and she did something so remarkable that even the Romans recorded it, though they tried their best to minimize it afterward. The Romans, under Emperor Augustus, had recently conquered Egypt. Emboldened by their new territory, they pushed south and attacked Kushite settlements. They took prisoners, looted towns. Amanirenas fought back. She led her own army north into Roman-held Egypt. She attacked and captured the city of Sian, modern-day Aswan. Her forces tore down statues of the Roman Emperor Augustus and buried the bronze head of one statue beneath the steps of a temple, so that every person entering the temple would walk over the face of the man who thought he could conquer them. That bronze head was found by archaeologists in 1910. It is now in the British Museum. Amanirenas then fought the Romans to a negotiated peace. Not a surrender, a negotiation. The Roman historian Strabo records, with obvious discomfort, that the Kushite queen sent ambassadors to Augustus, and the terms they secured were favorable. Rome, the most powerful military empire in the world at that point, negotiated a peace treaty with an African queen they had underestimated. The statues she captured, the head she buried, the treaty she won. Amanirenas, a name that should be as famous as Cleopatra. Almost nobody knows it. After the period of Egyptian conquest in the 25th dynasty, the center of Kushite power moved south to a city called Meroe. And at Meroe, something remarkable happens. The kingdom stops simply absorbing Egyptian culture and begins developing its own. A new writing system is invented, Meroitic script. It is one of the few writing systems ever developed in sub-Saharan Africa. Linguists and archaeologists can read the letters, they know the alphabet, but the language itself remains only partially translated. We can sound out the words, but we do not fully understand them yet. Think about that for a moment. There is an entire written language from a sophisticated African civilization that we have not yet fully decoded. The knowledge is there. The writing is on the walls of temples and in inscriptions across the Nile Valley. But so much of the scholarly focus of the 19th and 20th centuries went elsewhere that the language remains partially a mystery. At Meroe, the Kushites also develop advanced ironworking technology. The ironworking site at Meroe is one of the largest ancient industrial complexes ever discovered in Africa. Enormous slag heaps from centuries of metalwork, weapons, tools, agricultural implements. They develop sophisticated water management systems in a region that receives very little rainfall, irrigation, reservoirs, agricultural technology that allows a city to thrive in a landscape that should not be able to support one. They build temples to gods that are distinctly their own. Apenamak, the lion-headed war god, who has no equivalent in Egyptian theology. Art and architecture that increasingly reflects Kushite rather than Egyptian identity. This is a civilization coming into its own, finding its voice, building its own legacy on top of the foundation it had spent centuries absorbing. And then the world moves on and forgets them almost entirely. So how does a civilization of this scale and sophistication get erased? The answer is a combination of three things, and understanding all three matters. The first is geography. The Kushite heartland, modern-day Sudan, sits outside the zone of European colonial interest and academic focus for most of the 18th and 19th centuries. The great archaeological projects of that era focus on Egypt, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia. Sudan is peripheral, difficult to access, less prioritized. The second is racism. This is not comfortable to say, but it is historically accurate and needs to be said directly. The dominant intellectual framework of 19th century European scholarship included the belief that sophisticated civilization in sub-Saharan Africa was impossible or required outside influence to explain. When archaeologists found evidence of advanced architecture, writing, and art in the Kushite heartland, the instinct was not to revise the framework. It was to find alternative explanations. Some scholars in the 19th century literally argued that the pyramid builders of Sudan must have been colonists from somewhere else, that the sophistication of the finds could not be indigenous. These arguments were made not because the evidence supported them, but because the ideology demanded them. The third is the direct physical destruction. Ferlini and the pyramids. Colonial-era looting. Neglect of sites that did not fit the dominant historical narrative. Meroitic script left unstudied for decades. Museums that acquired Kushite artifacts and then failed to display or research them adequately. Erasure is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a choice about what is worth studying, what is worth funding, what is worth including in the school curriculum. Those choices have consequences that last for generations. The Kingdom of Kush does not end suddenly, it fades. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the kingdom is under pressure from multiple directions. The rise of the Kingdom of Aksum to the east, and in what is now Ethiopia, cuts off trade routes. Roman influence in the north reshapes regional politics. Internal instability weakens central control. Around 350 AD, the city of Meroe is sacked by the Aksumite king Ezana. The kingdom fragments. The great urban centers are abandoned. The pyramid fields fall silent. The civilization that had existed in some form for 3,000 years ends, not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with a slow fragmentation over generations. The pyramids remain, the inscriptions remain, the ironworking sites remain, the temples remain, but the people who could read the language, who knew the stories, who understood the context, they scatter. Their knowledge disperses. Their written tradition breaks. And then the European scholars arrive 3,500 years later and decide what it all means. That is the moment the second erasure happens. Not the destruction of the civilization, but the misinterpretation of its remains by people with an ideological stake in not understanding it correctly. You might be thinking, this is ancient history. Why does it matter today? Here is why. The history we teach shapes the stories we tell about human capability, about which cultures produced civilization, about which peoples have a legacy worth inheriting. When the Kingdom of Kush is left out of the story, when the most pyramid-building civilization in human history is reduced to a footnote or omitted entirely, it distorts our understanding of what Africa was, what it is, and what it can be. Over 1 billion people live in Africa today. The continent has a history of sophisticated civilization, complex governance, advanced technology, and artistic achievement that stretches back further than almost anywhere else on Earth. That history was systematically minimized by academic neglect, by colonial looting, by a 19th century intellectual framework that could not accommodate the evidence in front of it. Correcting that record is not about politics. It is not about grievance. It is about accuracy. The Kingdom of Kush existed. It was extraordinary. It built more pyramids than Egypt. It produced queens who negotiated with Rome. It invented writing systems and developed iron technology and built cities in the desert. And it deserves to be known. The next time someone says Egypt and pyramids in the same breath, you now know there is a longer, deeper, more complex story underneath that sentence. 255 pyramids. 3,000 years. A queen who buried Rome's emperor under her temple steps. A writing system we still cannot fully read. An empire that taught itself everything Egypt knew, and then outlasted it. That is the Kingdom of Kush. And that is why history matters. Not as a collection of dates to memorize, but as the true and complete story of what human beings have been capable of. All human beings. Across all of recorded time. If this video gave you something you did not know before, please hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds and it directly helps this channel reach more people with history that needs to be told. And I have a question for you. What other civilizations do you think have been deliberately left out of the history we were taught? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one and I will be responding today. If you want more history that goes deeper than the textbooks, subscribe to World History Facts right now. Because next week we are covering the African king who was so wealthy he crashed the global economy just by going on a pilgrimage. You do not want to miss that one. This is World History Facts, the history they did not teach you, told the way it deserves to be told. See you in the next video.